Have you ever wondered if you're secretly broke compared to everyone else your age? Maybe you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, scrolling through your banking app, wondering how your college roommate just bought a house while you're still trying to figure out why your credit card balance keeps growing despite your best intentions. Or perhaps you're at a dinner party listening to someone casually mention their savings account balance and you're sitting there thinking, well, at least I have savings in my checking account for about 12 minutes after payday. Well, today I'm going to serve up some brutal reality about what the average 30-year-old's finances actually look like. And trust me, some of these numbers are going to make you feel either significantly better or significantly worse about your situation. Either way, by the end of this series, you'll know exactly where you stand compared to your peers, and more importantly, you'll understand why so many people your age are struggling with money in ways that previous generations never had to deal with. And I spend way too much time analyzing personal finance data and figuring out why entire generations seem to be financially stuck despite earning more money than their parents ever did. If you're interested in understanding the real financial landscape for 30-year-olds and maybe getting some perspective on your own situation, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button if this information helps you out. Now, before we dive into these eye-opening statistics, let me ask you something. When you think about the average 30-year-old's financial situation, what comes to mind? Do you picture someone who's got their act together, steadily building wealth, maybe shopping for their first house, planning a wedding, starting to think seriously about retirement? Or do you imagine someone who's basically treading water financially, making decent money, but somehow never getting ahead, wondering why adulting feels so much more expensive than anyone warned them about? The truth is, most of us have absolutely no idea what normal actually looks like when it comes to money at 30. We might have assumptions based on what we see on social media or hear from friends, but the reality is often dramatically different from what we imagine. And here's what makes this whole topic so fascinating and, frankly, a little disturbing. Understanding these numbers isn't just about satisfying your curiosity or making yourself feel better about your own financial situation. It's about recognizing that there's a massive shift happening in how entire generations approach money, debt, and wealth building. Think about it this way. Your parents probably bought their first house in their 20s, had minimal student loan debt, and could realistically expect their income to provide a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. But if you're 30 today, you're navigating a completely different financial landscape. You're dealing with student loan balances that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago, housing costs that consume massive portions of your income, and economic realities that have fundamentally changed what it means to be financially successful. So let's start with something that affects virtually every 30-year-old in America today: student loan debt. And I'm warning you right now, these numbers are going to be shocking, especially when you see how they compare to what previous generations dealt with. According to the most recent federal data, 30-year-olds are carrying an average of $42,000 in student loan debt. $42,000, that's not a typo, and that's not the total amount they borrowed. That's what they still owe after years of making payments. To put this in perspective, that's more than many people's annual salary, and it represents debt that most 30-year-olds will be carrying well into their 40s. But here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean completely insane. The average monthly payment on that $42,000 is about $436. That's $436 every single month that can't go towards saving for a house, building an emergency fund, investing for retirement, or frankly, just enjoying life. It's money that disappears into the federal loan servicing system for the next decade, assuming you're on the standard 10-year repayment plan. Now, here's the kicker that nobody talks about. A huge percentage of 30-year-olds aren't even on the standard repayment plan because $436 a month is too much for their budget. They've switched to income-driven repayment plans that lower their monthly payments but extend their repayment period and often result in their loan balances actually growing over time due to interest capitalization. Let me tell you about Michael, and this is a real situation that represents millions of 30-year-olds across the country. Michael is 31, works as a software engineer, and earns $75,000 a year, which sounds pretty good, right? He's definitely above average for his age group. But Michael has $65,000 in student loans from his computer science graduate program. When he first graduated, he chose an income-driven repayment plan because the standard payment seemed overwhelming. His monthly payment was $420, which felt manageable. But here's what happened over the next 3 years. Despite making every single payment on time, Michael's loan balance grew from $65,000 to $68,500. His payments weren't even covering the interest that was accumulating, so he was literally paying money every month to watch his debt increase. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Imagine the feeling of being responsible, making your payments, doing everything you're supposed to do, and watching your debt grow anyway. When Michael finally realized what was happening and switched to the standard repayment plan, his monthly payment jumped to $780 because now he was paying on the higher principal balance. That's over 15% of his gross income and about 20% of his take-home pay after taxes and retirement contributions. Michael's story illustrates something crucial about student loan debt for 30-year-olds. It's not just about the monthly payment amount. It's about how the complexity of repayment options can actually trap borrowers in cycles of growing debt, and how this affects major life decisions like when to get married, when to buy a house, when to start a family. These are all typical considerations for people in their 30s, and student loan debt is fundamentally altering the timeline for these milestones. The ripple effects of student loan debt extend far beyond just the monthly payments. Recent data shows that student loan delinquency has caused credit score drops of 100 points or more for over 1 million borrowers. People who previously had credit scores of 720 or higher saw average declines of 177 points. This means that 30-year-olds who might have qualified for good mortgage rates, car loans, or credit cards are now facing higher borrowing costs or outright denials for new credit. It creates this vicious cycle where student loan problems compound into broader financial difficulties, affecting everything from car purchases to home ownership prospects. And unlike other types of debt, student loans can't be discharged in bankruptcy, meaning this burden follows 30-year-olds regardless of their financial circumstances. But student loans are just one piece of the debt puzzle for 30-year-olds. Credit card debt tells an equally concerning story, and it reveals how economic pressures and lifestyle inflation converge during this particular life stage. The average 30-year-old is carrying over $4,000 in credit card debt. Now, $4,000 might not sound catastrophic compared to those student loan numbers, but credit card debt operates completely differently. We're talking about interest rates averaging around 22% annually, which means that $4,000 balance costs almost $900 per year just in interest payments. But here's what's really happening with credit card debt for 30-year-olds, and this is where the story gets more complex and frankly more relatable. This isn't necessarily debt from reckless spending or luxury purchases. This is debt from the reality of being 30 in America today. 30-year-olds today are using credit cards to cover basic necessities that previous generations could afford with their regular income. We're talking about groceries when paychecks don't stretch as far as expected, car repairs that can't wait for the next pay period, medical expenses that insurance doesn't fully cover, and yes, occasionally some retail therapy after staring at student loan balances that seem to multiply like rabbits. The data shows that younger consumers, especially millennials and Gen Z, are increasingly using credit cards and buy now, pay later services for everyday necessities. This isn't about buying designer handbags or taking luxury vacations. This is about the gap between what 30-year-olds earn and what it actually costs to live a basic adult life in modern America. Consider Sarah, who represents the median 30-year-old experience almost perfectly. Sarah is 30, works in marketing, and earns $58,000 annually, which puts her right at the national average for her age group. She graduated in 2016 with $35,000 in student loans, and she's been making payments for 8 years now. Her monthly student loan payment is $380. Sarah also carries $3,800 in credit card debt. Now, before you start thinking Sarah is financially irresponsible, let me break down how she accumulated this debt. $1,500 came from her car transmission failing 6 months after her warranty expired, because apparently car parts have a supernatural ability to sense the exact moment you're no longer covered. $800 accumulated from medical expenses when she had to go to urgent care twice in 1 year, and her high deductible health plan decided that being sick was clearly a lifestyle choice she should pay for. The remaining $1,500 represents what financial experts euphemistically call lifestyle inflation, but what Sarah calls trying to maintain her sanity while adulting. This includes things like occasionally buying groceries without checking her bank balance first, replacing her laptop when it decided to crash during an important work presentation, and yes, sometimes ordering takeout after working a 10-hour day because the alternative was crying into a bowl of cereal. Sarah's minimum credit card payment is about $120 monthly, but here's where the mathematics of being 30 gets really depressing. At 22% interest, if Sarah only makes minimum payments, she'll be paying off this debt for over 18 years and will end up paying more than $8,000 total for that transmission repair and those urgent care visits. The real problem isn't that Sarah is financially irresponsible. The real problem is that she's spending 38% of her take-home pay on rent for a one-bedroom apartment, another 15% on her car payment and insurance, and roughly 10% on student loans and credit card payments combined. This leaves her with limited funds for building an emergency fund, which means the next unexpected expense will likely end up on a credit card too. Sarah's situation perfectly illustrates why credit card debt has become such a persistent problem for 30-year-olds. It's not about lack of financial discipline, it's about the mathematical reality that even responsible spending habits and steady employment can barely keep pace with the cost of basic adult responsibilities. But here's where things get even more interesting, and by interesting, I mean soul-crushingly expensive. Let's talk about housing, because this is where 30-year-olds today face perhaps the most dramatic departure from previous generations' financial experiences. The homeownership rate for adults under 35 has dropped to 37%, the lowest level in 4 years. This means that nearly 2/3 of 30-year-olds are still renting, not by choice, but because homeownership has become mathematically impossible for most people their age. The average home price in America is now over $500,000. $500,000. To put this in perspective, that means a typical 30-year-old would need a $100,000 down payment to put 20% down and avoid private mortgage insurance. $100,000. Most 30-year-olds don't have $100,000 in their checking account, let alone available for a down payment. But wait, it gets worse. Even if you could somehow scrape together that down payment, the average interest rate for a 30-year mortgage in 2024 was 6.7%. That means monthly payments on a $500,000 house with 20% down would be approximately $2,400, not including property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Or $2,400 per month. Remember Sarah, our median 30-year-old earning $58,000 annually? Her take-home pay after taxes is probably around $3,800 monthly. A $2,400 mortgage payment would consume 63% of her entire take-home income. Financial experts recommend spending no more than 28% of gross income on housing, which for Sarah would be about $1,350 monthly. This is why so many 30-year-olds are still living in apartments that cost $1,800 to $2,000 per month in rent. They're spending 40 to 50% of their income on housing, not because they're making poor choices, but because those are literally the only options available in most markets. The psychological impact of this housing situation cannot be understated. Previous generations viewed their 20s as the time to get established and their 30s as the time to buy a house, start a family, and build wealth through home ownership. Today's 30-year-olds are watching their rent payments disappear into landlords' pockets month after month, building zero equity, while home prices continue rising faster than their ability to save for down payments. Many 30-year-olds find themselves in this bizarre financial limbo where they earn too much to qualify for first-time homebuyer assistance programs, but too little to actually afford homes in the areas where they work. They're stuck paying rent that's often higher than mortgage payments would be, but unable to access home ownership because of down payment requirements and debt-to-income ratios. This housing crisis is fundamentally altering life timelines for 30-year-olds. People are delaying marriage because combining two sets of student loan payments doesn't improve anyone's debt-to-income ratio for mortgage qualification. They're postponing having children because raising kids in small rental apartments while paying off student loans and credit card debt feels financially irresponsible. They're watching their peers in lower cost areas buy houses and start families while feeling trapped in expensive cities where their careers are located, but homeownership remains a fantasy. The rental market itself has become increasingly predatory toward 30-year-olds. Landlords now routinely require credit scores above 700, proof of income at least 3 times the monthly rent, and application fees that can run several $100s per apartment. For 30-year-olds dealing with student loan impacts on their credit scores, finding acceptable rental housing has become a challenge that previous generations never faced. But perhaps the most shocking statistic about 30-year-old finances isn't about debt at all, it's about savings. And the numbers are going to make you question everything you thought you knew about financial responsibility. According to financial experts, 30-year-olds should have the equivalent of their annual salary saved by age 30. So if you're making $60,000 a year, you should theoretically have $60,000 sitting in savings accounts and investment portfolios. Ready for the reality check? Only 14% of Americans have at least $100,000 in savings, and more than half of all Americans can't cover an unexpected $1,000 expense without going into debt. Let me repeat that because it's important. More than half of Americans your age cannot handle a $1,000 emergency without borrowing money. We're not talking about a major medical crisis or losing your job. We're talking about your car needing new tires or your laptop deciding to transform into an expensive paperweight at the worst possible moment. The median savings balance for all Americans is $62,400. But remember, that includes people of all ages, including those nearing retirement who have had decades to accumulate wealth. When you break it down by age, the numbers become even more sobering. The reality is that most 30-year-olds have savings balances that financial advisors would describe as dangerously inadequate. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and this is something that nobody talks about in those cheerful financial planning articles. The advice to have a year's salary saved by 30 assumes that 30-year-olds have been able to save consistently throughout their 20s. It assumes they weren't dealing with entry-level salaries, student loan payments, high rent costs, and all the expenses that come with establishing adult life. Think about the mathematics here. If you graduated college at 22 with student loans, spent your early 20s earning $30,000 to $40,000 annually, while paying $600 monthly in student loans and $1,200 monthly in rent, when exactly were you supposed to accumulate this magical year's salary in savings? It's like telling someone to run a marathon while carrying a 50-pound backpack and then wondering why they're not setting speed records. The gap between financial advice and financial reality for 30-year-olds has become so wide that it's almost comical. Financial planning websites cheerfully suggest that 30-year-olds should be saving $800 monthly toward retirement alone. not counting emergency funds or other savings goals. $800 monthly for someone earning the median income of $58,000. That represents about 25% of their take-home pay after taxes. Meanwhile, back in the real world, that same person is spending 38% of their income on rent, 10% on student loans, and trying to maintain a social life that doesn't involve exclusively eating peanut butter sandwiches in their studio apartment. The idea of having $800 left over each month for savings exists in the same fantasy realm as unicorns and affordable health care. This creates what I call the financial advice paradox for 30-year-olds. Every article, podcast, and financial guru tells them they should be saving more, investing aggressively, and building wealth for the future. But the actual financial constraints they face make following this advice practically impossible without making sacrifices that would negatively impact their career prospects, relationships, or mental health. Consider retirement savings specifically, because this is where the disconnect between expectations and reality becomes most apparent. According to Fidelity, 30-year-olds should have a full year's salary in their retirement accounts. If you're earning $60,000, you should have $60,000 in your 401k. The reality? Most 30-year-olds have retirement balances that wouldn't fund a decent vacation, let alone decades of not working. The average retirement account balance for people in their 30s hovers around $14,000. $14,000 to fund potentially 40 years of retirement. Using the traditional 4% withdrawal rule, that $14,000 would generate about $560 annually in retirement income. That's $46 per month. $46 monthly wouldn't cover a cell phone bill, let alone housing, food, healthcare, and all the other expenses that come with being alive. So there you have it. The brutally honest financial reality of being 30 in America today. If these numbers made you feel worse about your situation, remember, you're not alone in this economic hellscape. If they made you feel better, congratulations on beating some pretty depressing odds. Either way, understanding where you actually stand compared to your peers is the first step toward making better financial decisions. Because, let's be honest, pretending everything is fine while drowning in debt isn't a strategy, it's just expensive denial.